Welcome to this training on how to start seeds and care for seedlings, sponsored by Seeds Generations. My name is Jason Matthias. My wife Shannon and I have 7 children from the ages of 14 down to 4, and we are a gardening family. I've been gardening all my life, and Shannon, growing up on a farm, did some of that as well. And we're raising our kids to learn how to grow their own food and understand where it comes from, the challenge in growing it, and have a true appreciation for real food. Out of that love for gardening and heirloom seeds was birthed our heirloom seed company called Seeds for Generations. And we work as a family in this business, not just in growing our garden together, but the kids are involved in every stage of the gardening process, from planting seedlings to harvesting seeds, and even more. I'll talk about a little bit more later. But we really just want to help other people grow more of their own food and live a healthier lifestyle. So we'd love for you to connect with us. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Pinterest, though Facebook and Instagram are where we're most active, and YouTube is where we publish our training videos. So you can look on our website for those, as well as check out our channel. I'd love for you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Pinterest as well, as we're going to be adding more content there in the coming weeks and months. Some of you may know this, and some of you may not, but my family's journey has been over the past 10 to 15 years. Really, a lot of it. It's basically been like a return to the old paths, where we've been relearning old skills and going back to the older way of doing things. Not just growing our own food, but raising animals, making a lot of our own health and beauty products and things like soap and other things. And part of that journey led me into partnering with a videographer and filmmaker. And together we made a documentary film called Beyond Off Grid, Return to the Old Paths. And I'd encourage you to see it. If you haven't seen it already, you can learn more at returntotheoldpaths.com. You may have also seen me on other online training events like this. I've been featured on the Homegrown Food Summit, the Garden Hack Summit, Back to Basics Living Summit, and the Mother Earth News Homesteading Summit. And this is one way that I try to pass on the things that I've learned through a lifetime of gardening. I was actually raised in the garden from my earliest days. You can see me there with my dad in the mid-70s, eating a bean fresh out of the garden, and we're raising our kids to do the same. I wanted to have a lifestyle with my family where we could work together and be together much of the time. And my background, going to Cornell University and graduating and being commissioned as a lieutenant in the Air Force, and going through pilot training and on to flying the KC-10, which is not pictured here. This is a C-130, but my last assignment on active duty was working with the Army. And this was a picture of me and a buddy of mine in Afghanistan. That lifestyle was not very conducive to the kind of family life I wanted to have. So I decided to leave active duty and go into the reserves and pursue entrepreneurship. And one of the things that came out of that, besides the ability to work with my family, was an ability to take our passion for gardening and share it with others, and inspire and help teach others how to grow more of their own food. So our kids are always into the dirt, usually barefoot in the warmer months, and we work together to grow most of our own food, and as well to preserve it. And we take the opportunity while we're doing that to create videos and other content that can be helpful to you and others that want to do similar things with their families. So before we jump in here, I wanted to give us kind of a inspirational quote, since there's not much green like you see in these pictures in most places, and it's kind of the dead of winter. This quote by Josephine Noose, I think, kind of sums it up. And it says, anyone who thinks gardening begins in the spring and ends in the fall is missing the best part of the whole year. For gardening begins in January with the dream. And indeed, as the dead of winter is here and many people are trapped inside, they're looking at seed catalogs and planning for a garden and the fruit of their labor in the summer. And hopefully you're the same. And I want to provide this training to you to help you do more with what you're putting in your efforts into gardening this year, in particular with starting seeds. So before we get into the actual training, let's go over some terminology first, just because there can be some confusion about these. But when we talk about heirloom seeds, what does that mean? Well, heirloom seeds are often referred to as open pollinated seeds, but basically they're a stable variety. They're stable genetically, and typically they've been passed down for many years, decades, or even centuries. And they're stable genetically in that they breed true in each generation. So if you save a seed from an heirloom variety, assuming it wasn't cross-pollinated by something, then in the succeeding year, if you plant that seed, you should get the same plant, the same variety, the same characteristics in the fruit. Hybrid seeds are produced by botanists, plant breeders, to exhibit specific traits. Many times it's for commercial production, so that the fruit has uniform size, shape. Tomatoes that don't split. For the ones you buy in the grocery store, typically the primary factors they're looking at are uniform size and shape, the ability to withstand transport long distances, not really put any kind of factor or the beauty of the fruit or the taste and nutrition of the fruit. Those are not priorities for commercial varieties, although you do see some more heirloom tomatoes show up in the grocery stores these days, but typically those are going to be grown by smaller local producers. Hybrid seeds are hand pollinated. It's crossing two different varieties of usually the same species to get a specific genetic combination, and the seeds in the fruit that result have specific traits that are desirable. For most garden plants, a lot of times these are going to be certain traits, like it can be size and shape, it could also be color, it could be growth habit, but often, and I think the most compelling reason to consider hybrid seeds, hybrid varieties, are for disease resistance. So if you have a particular disease problem, like maybe it's blight on your tomatoes or some other kind of a rust or something like that, you try everything else and you can't deal with it, then though I would encourage you to try everything else and be diligent in that, you might consider a hybrid breed that is more resistant to those specific diseases that you're fighting. The thing with hybrid seeds is if you save the seeds from the fruit that result, then most often you will not get the same variety in the succeeding generation. The children of fruit that result from the plant that comes from that seed that you saved is probably it's unstable genetically, and because it's first generation, and it's likely to revert to traits of the grandparents. So you're not going to get the exact same thing, most likely. There's a chance that you could, but most likely not. So typically you're not going to save hybrid seeds to grow in the next year. Okay. Now, a lot of people are concerned about genetically modified organisms and genetically modified seeds or genetically engineered seeds. This is not plant breeding. This is basically crossing different species through gene splicing or injection. It is not a natural process. It is typically it's going to be crossing two things that would not breed naturally in nature. The reason they're using genetic modification is because they can't breed them, and often it's crossing wildly different things, like bacteria that kill certain pests are bred into a particular plant so that it basically has its own pesticide. So having pesticides part of the plant is probably not the best idea for something that's going to be consumed by a human, right? But the most common use of genetic modification is for for mass-produced row crops like corn and soy, and those are typically done to resist herbicide application because herbicides are the main use of weed control, and the seeds are genetically engineered to withstand the massive amounts of herbicide that they put on the fields to kill the weeds so that those plants are the only ones that can grow. All right, so that's heirloom seeds, hybrid seeds, and genetically modified seeds, just as a primer, so we can get into the training now. So where to start? It'd be nice if we all had this little setup sitting in our basement or wherever we do our seed starting, right? But it doesn't have to look like this for you to be successful, but let's talk about some of the basic ingredients. You're going to need containers, obviously, to grow in. You're going to need soil or some kind of growing medium. Seeds, obviously, water, and light. One of the things you have to determine before you get started is the constraints that you're facing. Before you go planting a bunch of seeds, it's important that you consider the garden space you're going to plant them in, because you don't want to plant 2 or 3 times as many seeds or plants as you have room to grow, right? Because then you're going to have a bunch of stuff sitting in pots waiting for somewhere to go. And you either have to scramble to get a new garden bed put in, or you have to give them away to somebody else or sell them or whatever. So start with the end in mind. We'll talk in a little bit about how to figure out your spacing and how many to plant based upon your space that you have available. You wanted to make sure you consider the amount of space you have for your seedlings indoors, and realize that when you transplant things from the small cells in like the tray inserts that you put initially you plant your seeds in, and then you transplant them into a bigger pot, you're going to be increasing or multiplying the amount of space needed to keep those plants. And if you're talking about inside, it can add up quick. You can run out of room. So take that into account ahead of time. You want to consider your indoor environment. Temperature is a key thing to consider. For most seeds, a normal indoor temperature, most of us live in some kind of climate controlled system. Indoors, the temperature is usually set in the high 60s. That's good for most seed starting. However, there are some plants, like peppers in particular, seem to be the most problematic for a lot of people. That requires germination temperatures. The soil temperature has to be like 75 to 80 degrees is what they really prefer. So take that into account. And if you have a warmer place that you can put them, that's typically going to be beneficial. Light is an important thing. You can use natural light through windows. It does have some challenges, though. I'd recommend using artificial lighting, something like you see here with the grow light system, because it's going to give the amount of light needed for the seedlings to grow strong, and you can control how long the light's on, right? Rather than the sun, in the winter especially, the further north you get, the less number of hours of daylight you have. So humidity is one. If you have a really dry air environment, then your growing medium is going to dry out quicker. And that's something that you want to consider, because it'll mean that you're going to have to water more, potentially more than once a day. All right, if you want to determine how many seedlings to plant, you have to think about the garden space you have available and what you're going to plant where. And there's some calculations I'm going to go over here that'll help you determine how much space a certain number of plants will take up. Okay, so if you're using row garden spacing, the basic formula is the plant spacing, in other words, the spacing between plants in a row, times the number of plants, times the spacing between your rows, is going to equal the total number of square feet. Here's a chart that will help give some examples here. So with some commonly grown vegetable crops, if you want to plant 10 basil plants, plant spacing is recommended at 12 inches, and the spacing between rows is 1 foot, which means that if you have 10 plants, 12 inches or 1 foot times 1 foot is 1 square foot, so you have 10 square feet total area taken by those plants. Broccoli need 2 feet spacing, or it's recommended, and 1 foot spacing between rows, so 6 plants are going to take 12 square feet. So you can see how basically you take the the plant spacing in the row times the row spacing times the number of plants, and that will give you your total square feet. And if you put this in a spreadsheet, you can basically figure out, okay, I have 200 square feet to work with, and if you have the formulas that calculate the total area and sum them, you can play with the numbers of plants to figure out how many you can plant of each kind, right? Things like lettuce are not as critical as things like peppers or tomatoes or broccoli, right? Because those take up a lot more room, and when they get mature, they're pretty big, right? So lettuce grows fairly quickly and is fairly compact. So, if you have some extra lettuce, you can probably put it into some kind of container to grow it. A little more challenging with something like tomatoes in particular, typically are trellised. To grow those you can grow those in containers, but just you're going to have another challenge of trellising them or whatever if it's in a container. If you're using a square foot method, the formula is a little more simple. It's basically the number of plants per square foot times the number of plants gives you your total square feet, right? So if you're going to be planting something that has 4 plants per square foot and you want to plant 12 of them, that's going to be 12 square feet. So that is going to basically be a lot easier to calculate than the row garden method, because it's kind of built into the planning factors that square foot gardening uses. All right, so let's talk real quick about getting supplies, what things you need to consider when you're getting supplies. Obviously, you're going to need seeds, and if you can have this little guy providing them to you, that's a huge bonus. This is Levi, my 5-year-old. He's almost 6. He's a Lego maniac, but he also likes packing seeds, as you can see here. So you're going to probably need some kind of growing trays. What I like to use are what are referred to as 10-20 trays, or 10 inches by 20 inches, which is why they're called 10-20 trays. There are a couple different options you have for how to put the your seedlings into these. You can use seedling cells, which are shown at the top left there. It's basically an insert that goes into the tray, into the 10-20 tray, and then you would fill that with your growing medium. You can also use these little peat pots, which basically you just put your growing medium in there and then you plant in them, and then when they're ready to transplant, you just put the whole pot in the ground and it biodegrades and composts basically in place. So that is nice for a couple of reasons. If you're planting really small scale, those could be helpful. Those two, I'd recommend the tray inserts if you can use all of the cells in those inserts. There's also peat pellets. These are basically, they're basically peat that's been put into like a little mesh bag and compressed and dried out. So it's like a little puck when you get it, but when you get it wet, you soak it in water, it expands into a little, looks kind of like a marshmallow basically, but it's a little bag of peat that you can grow your seedlings in. Those can be good for people, especially if you're growing small quantities and maybe you're doing a bunch of different iterations. So you're maybe starting some seeds this week, some seeds next week, and you wouldn't be filling a whole tray of seedlings or something like that. You might want to consider using these. And then the other option is you can use a soil block maker, which I'll show you in a minute, but this is basically where you don't have a tray with cells that you put the growing medium in. You basically make the growing medium of a specific type and consistency, and then use basically a press that creates the soil blocks, and then you plant into those. So let's talk about the growing medium. You can buy pre-made mixes, and that's the easiest, obviously, right? You can make your own, which if you're doing in larger quantities is what I'd recommend, just because it's going to be less expensive for sure. If you're making your own, here's a basic recipe for a homemade seed starting mix. 4 parts screen compost. I recommend using a 1/4-inch screen. You can make a screening tray using it's sometimes referred to as hardware cloth. It's basically a wire mesh that's got various size holes in it. A quarter might be 3/8, but a quarter, a half typically are the ones that are most common. So 4 parts of screen compost, 1 part perlite, which is basically it's like puffed rocks basically, and what they do is they hold moisture. So and then they release it into the rest of the growing medium as it needs it. So it helps regulate moisture content basically. Vermiculite, it does a similar thing, but it's a more fine grain consistency. And then 2 parts peat moss or core is basically like coconut husk that's been shredded up. And it has a similar type of property as peat moss, which is basically it provides some moisture holding capability without providing a lot of density. So it kind of lightens up the mix is what it does. Right, so you just basically mix all those. So depending on how big of a batch you want, if you're going to want to use a small batch, you might use like a cup. You might use a gallon, whatever it is, and then you just use those ratios to make your mix. All right. Soil blocking. This is what I was referring to before. You can see the press there. There's a specific recipe, which I won't include here because most people don't use them, but this is what we use because we make a lot of seedling starts. And so because the seedling trays, while they're convenient, they typically only get like maybe 2 to 3 seasons out of them. I don't have anything that I have to replace with these. The soil blocking makers, the press is maybe $20 to $30, but it'll last for 20 years. And once you get accustomed to it, you can crank these out really quickly. Soil blocks basically use a special mix, as a special consistency. It's different than your typical soil starter mix, like I mentioned in the last slide. The soil blocks actually provide the form. They don't need something to be in. It's kind of like those expanding pucks I told you about, except that there's no like mesh bag that they're in. It's just the soil itself. The roots provide strength. As the roots expand into the mix, they basically help bind it together when you end up moving them to transplant them. The mix has a lot more peat moss to provide structure. And then it also has some sand in there to provide for drainage. And the really nice thing about these is that they're easy to handle when you're transplanting. Sometimes the seedling cells the tray inserts that go inside of the 1020 trays can be difficult to get the root structure and the soil block out of the cell. These ones are not, because unless you let them go too long and the roots have actually gone into the other soil block next to it, which usually only happens with like tomatoes if you let them go a really long time. Outside of that happening, the soil blocks just kind of come apart, and then you can basically plop them in your transplanting hole. So it makes them really easy for transplanting when you're doing that step. All right, let's talk about some dates and how to calculate when to plant your seedlings. So most of the US is having a frost tonight. As I'm giving this webinar, because the polar vortex is sweeping down from up north and creating some bitter wind chills. So a lot of people have seen this zone map, and it's a good thing to reference and a good thing to know. However, it's important to know not just your zone, but know what this zone map is used for. This is actually for perennial plants. It's not for annual plants, which is what most garden vegetables are. So a lot of people will ask, hey, what's your zone or whatever? And while that gives you some indication of maybe like when you might plant something, really what the zone does, it tells you what's the extreme minimum temperature. And it's hard to see, but on the right here, the legend for this color-coded key It says average annual extreme minimum temperature from 1976 to 2005. So basically over a 30-year period, what is the coldest it gets in the winter? Okay, and it's a range. Each of these colors is a range. This is used primarily for perennial crops like flowers, especially like bulbs, tulips, hyacinth, all the bulb type flowers, because those bulbs are only cold tolerant down to a certain temperature. A lot of other types of plants too, that you might use for landscaping, those kind of things. Some herbs as well only have a cold tolerance down to a certain temperature. So it's important to know your zone for that stuff, but it actually doesn't have any bearing whatsoever directly on when to plant your seeds for your annual crops in your garden. Okay. What you need for your annual crops in your garden is you need to know your last average spring frost date. Okay. That will help you determine your season length. Specifically, your last average spring frost date is the date you need to know for the spring. And then in the fall, you have a first average fall frost date. And if you're going to be doing fall gardening, you actually need to use that date to figure out when you need to plant your crops by in order to get a harvest before it freezes. But the difference between these two, well, actually, before I get that, the key with these terms is average. You can look up what your average frost date is for a city that you're in or that's nearest to you. However, if you're not right in the location where that data is from, let's say you're 20 miles away or 50 miles away, you can have very large variances with microclimates. A good example is where we live. We live in the mountains west of Roanoke, Virginia. Roanoke, Virginia is about 1,000 to 1,200 feet elevation. And the last average spring frost date is the first or second week of April. Typically the second week of April towards the middle of April. Okay. Where we live in a high mountain valley, we're at about 2,500 or 2,600 feet. So we're over double the elevation. And because we're in a high mountain valley with not very much elevation between where we're at and the ridge lines, the prevailing winds come from the west over the lower mountains in West Virginia, and then they hit the Allegheny ridgeline and they go up. And then our valley is actually the first wide valley that's high elevation that the wind comes down into. So we have a lot of wind all throughout the year, and you really feel it times like now where we have today. I think the winds were up to 25 miles an hour, and it was in the low 20s. So with the wind chill, it was down in the single digits. Now that doesn't affect our last average spring frost date. However, by the time that the Roanoke area is starting to warm up and it's about their spring frost date that they're using for calculations, we still have 2-3 more weeks. Typically our even 4 weeks. Our last frost date is like the second week of May, first or second week of May. A lot of the locals use Mother's Day as the kind of the guidepost. So I went into the example there of our situation because I think it's a good example of this situation where there can be very large differences in microclimates within. I mean, we're only maybe 20 miles from Roanoke. So you don't have to be that far. If you have a lot of elevation difference or you have certain microclimate characteristics like we do with wind and stuff and so forth, it can make a big difference on your dates. So you don't want to just blindly use the date that's in the city closest to you that you can find online. You want to make adjustments to that based upon the specific situation you're in. It's good if you check with your local ag extension because they might have some information for you that would be helpful in that regard, but especially you want to check with neighbors, particularly any neighbors you have whose families have been there for a long time and have been gardening. And like I mentioned, a lot of the locals where we live use Mother's Day as kind of the guidepost on the calendar for planting, like the last frost and planting stuff based on that. And then they'll use like, the second week of June is the soonest that you would get tomatoes in or something like that. Like there's different recommendations, and that's based on some of these people living here their whole lives, and they're in their 60s or 70s, and some of them, that's what their parents told them or their grandparents told them or something. So it's like some of this information is like 50 years old, right, based on historical trends that have been observed. So that's really helpful information if you can get it. So your season length generally is the difference between your frost dates. If you take your last frost date and subtract your first frost date from them, if you use Julian days, which is if you take every day of the year and you give it a number, 1 to 365, every date has a Julian number. And if you subtract the the spring frost from the fall frost, the difference between those two is going to give you your season length. For most people, it's going to be 120, maybe 150 days. But if you live in a more northern climate, you may have less than that. You may have closer to 100, and in some cases less. So that will affect, especially if you're considering growing any long season crops like winter squash that take 120 days or things like that. You want to take that into consideration. All right, so how to figure out your lead times. I'm going to use an example here of a last frost date of April 15th. And use the same example vegetables I used in the other one. Now, this data is typically going to be listed on the seed packet or on the seed supplier's website. We put ours on our seed packets, but we also have them listed on basically the growing instructions are in full on the website. So you can always go to our website to see what's recommended for each type. Typically, it's going to say something like 6 weeks before your last frost, plant indoors, and 2 weeks after your last frost, transplant outside in the garden, something like that. Okay, so that's basil. You're going to plant 6 weeks before your last frost, which using April 15th as our last frost date is going to make it March 1st. And then it's going to grow for 8 weeks, at least 8 weeks, because basil being cold sensitive, you don't want to put it outside typically before a couple weeks after the last frost date to make sure that you don't have a frost. And to be honest with you, basil and some other plants like tomatoes and even peppers don't like cold, even if it's not a frost. So if you put them out and you're getting cold temperatures and they're outside, then you may probably want to consider covering them with some kind of a row cover or plastic or something to insulate them and shield them from that temperature fluctuation that can stunt their growth. So with basil, in that example, you're going to transplant to the garden the end of April. Okay, broccoli, the same as basil in terms of how many weeks before the last frost date you start, but you can put broccoli out in the garden 2 weeks before the last frost date because being a brassica, it's more cold tolerant. Okay, so it's only going to be inside for 4 weeks. It'll go out by the end of March. Okay, so you can kind of see from this example, lettuce you plant 5 weeks before, put it out basically at the last frost date. Peppers need a long lead time, 10, sometimes 12 weeks, depending. Sometimes you see 12 weeks for peppers. When in doubt, do it earlier because that'll just give the seedlings more chance to mature more before you transplant them. But you definitely don't want to go earlier in terms of transplanting. Use those guidelines that you're given so that you can be sure that you're not putting them out too early and you might risk cold damage to the plants. Okay. So peppers are going to go out at the end of April. Tomatoes are not going to go out till the middle of May because they're particularly cold sensitive and don't like temps down in the 40s. So there's some examples for you how to calculate your lead times. If you stick around to the end, I'm going to tell you about a tool we have that basically does all this work for you. All right, so let's talk about germination requirements. What do you need to be able to have a successful germination of your seeds? First thing is to know, does your plant or your seedling, your seeds that you're planting need light or dark? Now, with very few exceptions, most seeds need light to germinate, okay? There are some, though I don't know of any vegetables that need darkness. There are some flowers that actually need darkness to germinate. So If you're doing flower gardening, you want to pay particularly close attention to that. You need to know, is your plant seedling need heat or cold? And while some plants can do okay with cold, you typically aren't going to need to put them plant seeds in a cold environment in order to germinate. Most of the ones that can tolerate cold are going to be able to germinate in a range of temperatures. The big one that ends up being a problem is the ones that need heat or really warm germination environments. Things like peppers, in particular, need like 75 to 80 degrees. And because most of us aren't keeping our houses at 75 to 80 degrees, this can be a big challenge. So we'll talk a minute about how to solve that problem. Some plants do best if you soak the seeds first. If they have a particularly hard seed, then soaking can be very helpful. Things like sweet peas can be, a lot of people soak those first. Or something called scarification, which is basically like nicking the seed or cracking it can help germination. The only one that I know of that's pretty common with this is morning glory. Morning glory has really hard seeds, and typically you have to nick them, like cut the tip off, or and soak them actually to get good germination of them. And that is typically to kind of mimic the process that they go through in nature, right? All right, let's talk about temperature control. I mentioned earlier about temperature. Sometimes you may need to use a heat source like a furnace. You know, it's typically warmer near your furnace than it is in the rest of the house. Or if you have like a wood stove, it's going to be warmer near the wood stove than it is on average in the rest of the house. That might be needed in order to germinate certain seeds, particularly ones I mentioned, peppers, particularly like very warm germination conditions. But if you don't have that, you can also buy heating mats that fit. They're the size of the 1020 trays, and you plug them in, and they basically warm up to about 80, 85 degrees. And that basically provides heat to the trays, which then heats the soil blocks or your growing medium up to a temperature that is going to help, particularly pepper seeds and other things like that, germinate more consistently. Another thing that can help, both for temperature as well as humidity control, are these little greenhouse covers. Now, if you buy one of these seed starting kits that has a 1020 tray and a seedling insert, seed tray insert, often it'll come with this little mini greenhouse cover. You don't have to use those. However, they can be helpful, particularly if the place where you have your seeds starting is not warm enough, or it's on the borderline, or if it's a really dry environment. As you can see in this picture, there's actually condensation on the inside of the clear cover, and that's because moisture given off by the plants and the soil is condensing on the inside of that cover. So what this does is it keeps it from drying out so quickly, and requires less frequent watering that way. So it retains heat and moisture, which are both things that you want to have in your seed starting area. Make sure you keep the seeds moist. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. Germination requires constant moisture for most seeds. Drying out can kill them. If they germinate and then they dry out enough, it can either stunt or kill the seeds, the seedlings, and they won't grow anymore. Or it can really just set them back, and you don't want to do that. So you need to make sure they have constant moisture. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can water. Consider bottom watering. Now, what bottom watering is basically, instead of watering the top, you basically, assuming that the growing medium you're putting them in has holes in the bottom. If you have a 1020 tray that's solid underneath, and then you have, you know, one of those insert trays, or like these are like 6-pack trays that are inside. If they're sitting in that, if you just basically fill up the bottom with water, the water is going to be pulled into the growing medium, and it'll keep the soil moist. And basically you can have extra water in the bottom, so that you're, you know, if you're gone all day for work or whatever, as long as you put some water on the bottom during the day, it'll pull that up into the growing medium to even out the moisture over time. There are also outdoor irrigation kits you can get, and little sprayers that you can put in there that'll spray. And you can even include timers for automation if you're gone or you go out on, if you maybe leave town on a trip or something and you need somebody can't take care of your place, you could still set up a timer with some kind of irrigation setup and be able to keep your seedlings watered. The best option if you don't have anything yet is to get a starter kit and then add components as needed. So I'm talking about these little irrigation kits. So instead of buying a bunch of components specifically for what you get, in terms of the money you spend for what you get, if you buy a starter kit of one of those little garden black poly pipe irrigation kits, buy a starter kit and then buy whatever additional fittings or emitters that you need. That's typically the best way to go as far as getting what you need for your money. Let there be light. Light is very important for germination in most situations and for every situation for growth and development of the plant. So window lighting can be used effectively. However, insufficient light through windows is the most common cause that I've seen for leggy plants or plants that are growing thin and spindly because they don't have enough light to power the photosynthesis that's needed for the plant to develop the strength it needs. Indirect light is best. Not having enough light is not the only problem. You can actually have too much light. If you have too much direct sunlight, you can actually burn the plants. So if you're using a window, I'd recommend using some kind of translucent shade or maybe mini blinds or something like that that diffuse the light so it's not direct sunlight on the plants. That can be a gotcha that you can basically fry your plants. They get sunburn, too much sun. Basically, they can't handle it when they're young and immature. All right, if you're going to be using artificial lighting, there's a bunch of different options. Commercial grow lights are going to be the best in terms of the type of light that's provided and the efficiency of the fixture, typically. However, they can be very pricey. Okay, fluorescent shop lights are what I use because they're inexpensive and they get you about like 80 to 90% of what you need. And that's good enough for me. I've used them for years and they work fine. They are, like I said, they're not the 95 to 99% solution. But if you're looking at commercial grow lights, you can be talking about $100 plus per fixture, and multiplying that times a bunch of fixtures if you're growing in any kind of scale. So it gets expensive very quickly. And in most cases, that expense is only justified if you're growing commercially. I highly recommend you use a timer and that you set the timer to go have the lights on for 16 hours. The reason being is that plants need a lot of light to grow strong. Not enough light is a much bigger problem than too much light. Had times when the timer wasn't set right or something and it stayed on all the time. Never really saw any negative impacts from that, but not having enough light can be a big problem. So you give them 8 hours of sleep, but after that, it's on for 16 hours during the day. If you have your seedlings near a window where they get a lot of light during the day, you can actually set the timer to come on before daylight, run for a few hours, and then go off when they get enough sunlight, and then have them go off when it's daytime. And then when, towards sunset, the lights would come on again and then run into the night to get to your 16 hours. So you still want to give them 16 hours, even if it's a combination of artificial light and natural light. You can look for deals on Craigslist, particularly for the commercial grow lights. You can often get a really good bargain on lights that may not have a lot of use and still work great for a long time. All right, so if you're going to have artificial lighting, you're probably going to need some kind of a stand to put your seedlings in and hang your lights from. So this is one that I made quite a few years ago. I use a single 4-foot shop light for 2 1020 trays lengthwise. And I built this grow light stand basically where I can put 4 1020 trays in each shelf. So it's basically about a 2-foot by 4-foot shelf, and that will fit 4 10-20 trays with a little bit of extra room, wiggle room around the edges. And then I hang the shop lights via chains that they come with from hooks that are on the end. So that gives me the ability to adjust the lighting height above the plants, which is very important. You want the lights to be as close to the plant's foliage as possible. So when they're little, they should be right down near the plants. And as the plants start growing up into the light, you want to basically adjust them, every few days or however often you need to, upwards to stay just above the plants. As I mentioned, use a timer to provide 16 hours of light. Fertilization, if you have a good compost that you're using in your soil starting mix, then you may not need it. But if you do need to add fertilizer, then I recommend that you look for any signs of deficiencies, particularly yellowing means not enough nitrogen. Okay. So you can use a good quality organic fertilizer. I recommend you get a liquid and mix it in water to dilute it to the recommended concentration. And then you basically can spray it using a pump sprayer on your plants. Or if you're bottom watering, you can apply it that way as well. Just for the record, I didn't mention it before, but the way that I water my seedlings is using a pump sprayer. And then sometimes I will also stick the little nozzle like to the side of the seedlings and bottom water a little bit as well. So I want to basically make sure that the top of the growing medium is well watered and moist, but then I'll add some to go down underneath and provide a little bit extra water in the bottom of the tray so that they stay moist throughout the day, and I only have to water them once or maybe twice a day. But I know that they won't dry out that way. So how do you keep track of your plants, right? This is actually really important because if you're growing different varieties of tomatoes, which most of us are going to want to grow more than one variety of tomato or pepper, how do you know what's what until it produces? And keep it organized going into the garden, all that kind of stuff. So you want to keep track of your plants. This is just basic organization. That's really good to do. If you get the standard starter trays, those typically will have 72 cells. It'll be 6 by 12 long. If you do that, you don't have to plant just one type of vegetable or whatever in each tray. Or like you can see here, these ones are kind of divided up into like blocks of 9. You don't have to do each block of 9 in one type or another, right? Way I do it is obviously plant what you need, but I typically do them in rows along the short axis. So the 6 across, I'll do them in rows, like one row or 2 rows or 3 rows, however many I need of that particular one. Keep track using a chart. Graph paper is the easiest thing that I've found to use. And you basically draw a grid that's the size of your tray. And in this case, it's the soil blocks that we use are basically, you can fit 50 in a 10-20 tray, basically 5 on the short edge and then 10 long. So that's what this example drawing is from. It's basically 5 squares on the graph paper wide by 10 long. And then I basically divide them up into rows. And I'm often growing, maybe I'm growing different kinds of broccoli. So I'm growing 5 of one broccoli variety, 5 of another. But some other things I might want to grow a lot more plants. I might have, 10 or 15. So I just put a line across and then I write in whatever the variety is. That's what I found it works best. It's a lot easier to do it in rows just for the purpose of keeping track of it than it is to divide it into other odd shapes, right? So you want to write the variety of each of the rows or sections that you have on your chart. And it's very important to include the date of the planting. If you have some seeds that don't germinate and I'd recommend replanting them, make sure you write down the replanting date as well. So you can see at the top right of this example on the left, I planted the original one on February 22nd, and then I replanted on March 18th for ones that didn't germinate. So make sure you put all that data on there, because what that's going to do is it's going to tell you that's the date that you're going to be basing your date to harvest based upon, because your days to maturity you would add to whatever date you planted them on. And you want to have that recorded somewhere. It's easiest I found to record it here. If you have a garden journal or something like that, you can also put it in there, but you I'd recommend at least putting it on your chart that you have all of your seedlings listed on. All right, let's talk about some common problems, because I've actually had several people ask questions already in the chat about issues they've been having. So let's talk about some common problems, and at the end, if I haven't answered those, then I'll go through the questions that we have and answer those in turn. All right. So one common problem that happens that a lot of people don't even know what it's called or what it is. It's called damping off, and damping off is kind of a weird name because it's basically a fungus. Um, and what it does is it affects the stem and it restricts the flow of nutrients. And so you have, this is a celery or parsley. I'm not sure actually, because they both look about the same when they're in the seedling stage like this. But basically it starts growing, and then the stem kind of like starts withering and the plant falls over and then it just dies. That's damping off, what damping off looks like. So the thinning of the stalk at the base is the first indication that you have damping off. It's unfortunate, but it's really hard to reverse. But if you keep an eye on it and see it starting to form, then you can try to prevent it or halt its advancement and potentially save the plants. And so some ways to prevent it. The first one is just a completely preventative one, which is to start with sterile soil. If you use pre-mixed potting mix or seed starting mix, then typically you won't have this issue because it's sterilized. Or you can sterilize your soil by baking it in an oven or microwave. And basically what you're doing is by heating it up, you're killing the fungus that would cause problems like damping off and other fungal diseases in your seedling growing medium. Another thing is you don't want to overwater or allow their feet to soak, the roots. So this is kind of, there's a balance here, because I was telling you earlier about bottom watering, which is exactly counter to what this says, right? So while you can bottom water, realize that you don't want to have, if your 10-20 tray is like 1.5 inches tall, you don't want to have 1 inch of water in there. Okay, you're talking about maybe 1/4 inch of water at the bottom. When the plants are very young, that 1/4 inch of water at the bottom is not going to make their roots be completely saturated. Basically, what that's going to do is it's going to provide water contact at the bottom of the tray with your soil blocks or your seed cells, that will then draw the water up into the growing medium to equalize the moisture level. As the top dries out, it'll pull water up into the growing medium. Okay, so it's important that if you're going to bottom water, that you don't overdo it. Okay, that's what this the point of this that I wanted to make. Add a fan. So a fan on kind of a low setting, providing some air movement, is going to basically challenge the plants to kind of stiffen their cell walls, and that can help to combat. It's kind of like exercise for the plants, right? So one way to help combat getting weak stems, for like damping off creates, is to basically exercise your plants by putting some air across them. Okay, that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is prevent the fungus from developing. So you can use antifungal treatments. Hydrogen peroxide diluted in water is one option. And then also you can make a chamomile tea, which is believed to help fight the fungal infection that causes damping off. All right, let's talk about managing growth, right? As your plants, your seedlings start to grow, you're going to need to manage your growth. And there's a couple things to do here. One is to control plants like that grow really tall and can be go kind of crazy, like tomatoes. You can pinch back the taller plants, and what that means is by tomatoes especially, you can basically pinch off some of the top parts of the plant, and it gives you more bushy growth. You may not want to do this depending on the type of tomatoes you're growing and what you want to do, but typically one thing you want to do here too, and this is particularly important for things like tomatoes, I often plant more than one seed per cell. I'll plant like 2 seeds per cell, particularly for tomatoes. If you get both of them germinate, you don't want those competing with each other. So what I recommend that you do is you prune or just pinch off the smaller of the two once they get kind of established, and you see which one is obviously the stronger plant. Keep the stronger plant, take the other one away, and you can just do that by pinching it off at the base of the stem. You can also use scissors and cut it. But what that does is basically gives all the nutrients to the one plant that you're going to be growing out. I mentioned this before, prematurely, I guess, but adjust the height of your lighting units if you're using artificial lighting like grow light setup to keep them close but not touching the plants. And then the other thing you want to do is keep repotting. You want to make sure that your roots have enough room to grow. So, something that's the size of those little seedling cells or soil blocks like I use really is only got enough room for the roots, for the plants till they're, 6 inches tall or less, probably. And you want to try to transplant them into a larger growing area when they start getting more mature, so that they can continue growing at a normal pace and they're not constrained in their growth because they're in too small of a growing environment. So generally it's better to repot sooner rather than later. Most plants benefit from a deep planting to develop additional roots from the main stem. This is particularly true with tomatoes. Most other nightshades, I think, too, will also root from the stem, but tomatoes in particular, I mean, tomatoes don't even need to be in touch with the ground. If you have a really moist environment, you'll see the little root nodules start to form on the stems. But basically what this means is that instead of, if you have like a 4-inch pot, instead of putting a bunch of soil in it and then basically digging a little hole and sticking that little transplant right at the top, you might want to put a little bit of soil at the bottom. Maybe in a 4-inch pot, you might want to have like a 1/2 inch of soil on the bottom, but then put your transplant in that and then fill all around it with soil so that you have, an inch or so of the root of the stem now below the soil line, because what that's going to do is all of that area that's in contact with the moist soil is going to develop new roots. And so you have more root mass, which means that the plant can grow faster and more robust. Another important thing to consider is to harden off your plants. Okay. Now, a lot of people don't realize this until they've inadvertently killed their plants once or twice or a couple years in a row. But hardening your plants to the outdoor environment is basically you want to gradually acclimate them to the outdoors. You don't want to take something that's been indoors, unless you've been using a fan. Most people don't. It hasn't have much airflow. It's in artificial lighting. It's in a stable temperature environment. If you just transplant that thing right into the garden, and now it's got direct sun on it, it's got fluctuating temperatures throughout the day, it's got wind, all this stuff, that's a huge amount of transplant stress on that plant. Okay, so hardening off or hardening your plants is a way that you can gradually acclimate them to the outdoor environment, which is going to give them much less transplant shock and much better chance of not just surviving, but of thriving in the garden environment that you're going to be transplanting them into. This picture on the left is basically a bunch of tomatoes that are transplanted into 4-inch pots. And one thing I want to mention here, this goes into back to the beginning when we talked about planting with the end in mind, and particularly knowing how much space you need indoors. We grow a lot of tomatoes. We typically grow, for 6-7 years, we've grown at least 100 tomato plants every year. If I've got 50 soil blocks in my seedling trays, I can plant 2 trays of tomatoes, which is 100 soil blocks. However, when I transplant those into 4-inch pots, I can only get 10 4-inch pots in a 10-20 tray. So 10 4-inch pots in one 10-20 tray versus 50 soil blocks in the same 10-20 tray means that I'm quintupling the number of trays that I have to have space for my tomatoes once I transplant them. And this picture is a direct example of what that looks like. Okay, so this is when I said make sure you have enough room inside. You have to consider not just how much room you need when you start, but after you transplant plants into bigger containers that they need to be in order to continue developing before you put them out in the garden. You need to make sure you have enough room for that, right? Okay. Now, between when they're inside growing in, say, tomatoes in 4-inch pots, what I do is fans indoors can help begin the process of that, strengthening the cell walls and stuff to the outdoor environment. But once it's warm enough outside on like a warm day, I will start by taking them and putting them in indirect sunlight. You don't want to put them right in direct sunlight after being in artificial light inside or being in indirect natural light inside. You want to start with indirect sunlight. So put them in a shaded area, but put them in an area that is going to be warm and protected from excessive wind. You want to have a little bit of breeze or whatever, but you don't want to put them out on a really windy day, and you don't want to put them directly in the sun right to start. And maybe after a couple days in indirect sunlight, then maybe you put them in a place where they might get an hour or two of direct sunlight. Okay. And then a few days later, you may increase that where they're in a place where they're getting even more sunlight, right? So you want to do this gradual acclimation process to harden the plants to get them more used to the outdoor environment, but you want to do it slowly in blocks of 2 to 3 days at a time. You don't want to do it, in certainly not all at once, but you also don't want to do it just in like one stage. You don't want to take them from inside to direct sunlight for 4 hours the first day, and then, a couple days of that, and then put them in the garden a few days after that. It's best if you can do it as gradual as possible. So you have to think of all the factors that go into account here: sunlight, indirect and direct sunlight, wind, outside temperature. So a lot of this is going to be based on what the weather forecast looks like, right? And can be difficult if you don't, if you're working outside the home or nobody's home during the day, to be able to keep an eye on it and move them. So one way that you can help remedy that challenge, if you're not there to tend them and check on them several times throughout the day, is to use a cold frame. If you have a greenhouse, that's great. But if you have a sheltered location, sheltered from wind and direct midday sun, that's great. But a cold frame like this, which you can also build them, I'll give you some other examples. But basically what that does is it helps to regulate the temperature. And one thing you can do with cold frames is you can actually not only increase the sun gradually, because you can also put you can put shade cloth or something over this. If you have direct sun, you can use that as well. But you can decrease the protection from cold at night. So if you put the plants outside for a few hours during the day, but bring them in at night, then they're not getting exposure to the nighttime temperatures, right? So it can be hard to do this if you're still getting fairly cold temperatures at night, but a cold frame can be a way that you can help boost the overnight temperature. So you can basically put them in a cold frame, and during the day it might be open to give them more airflow and more sun exposure, and it's warmer during the day, obviously. But then at night you can close the lid, which keeps that heat in and retains the heat, and then the temperature inside will not decrease to as low as it will be in the outside environment. Okay. And this can be particularly a way that you can help remedy the challenge of having enough space inside to keep your 10 trays of tomato plants. Like I've found myself, I've found myself more than once having that challenge. So I basically built a little cold frame to be able to help remedy that challenge and not have to move them inside every night. Though if it's going to get really cold, then I'll typically do that. But as long as you've got normal fluctuations in temperatures like you do in the spring, you can use a cold frame to help protect them. All right, real quick before we wrap up and go into the Q&A, I want to talk about some alternatives to seeds, because I'm an out of the box thinking kind of guy. And as my youngest daughter Annalie pictured here, actually a couple of years ago, she's not so little anymore. I think she was 2 here, and she's 4 now. There is some alternatives to starting plants with seeds that you might want to consider that you can do indoors, as well as planting seeds indoors. So a celery stalk can actually be regrown, because you typically only use the top part of the celery, and the base of the celery stalk is actually where it was cut off right at ground level, and that base can actually reroot and continue growing celery. Now, you won't necessarily get the most consistent results with this because it kind of depends on the plant and, you know, genetics and how it was cut and all that other stuff. But basically, if you take a celery stalk like this and stick it in a bowl of water so that the bottom part is in water, it may help to add a rooting hormone, but you can actually just start, once you start seeing roots come out of it in the water, then you can basically put it in a pot and then just keep watering, and eventually you're going to see it start sprouting. Even when it's just in water, you'll see the top start forming leaves and shoots coming out like this. And we've done this a few times, and you know, it is not the easiest thing to do to get consistent results where you actually grow a plant every time, but it can be done, and it's kind of a fun thing, especially to do with kids. You can also grow some plants from cuttings. So here's an example of fig cuttings. You just use a rooting hormone, and this is mostly perlite with some peat moss in it in the growing medium there, and some, basically you take the cutting off the branch of the fig tree and get the end wet and dip it in some rooting hormone, and then stick it down in the pot here, and they'll start rooting and growing, and then you can basically propagate fig trees that way. So that's one example. If you have friends with fig trees, ask them to let you take some cuttings. You can grow in fig trees. You can also grow your fruit scraps. I gave you an example earlier with the celery, but another one is pineapple, because just like celery, which is cut off at the ground, the pineapple, although the pineapple is the fruit from the flower at the top of the plant, the bottom of the pineapple will actually, I'm sorry, the top of the pineapple where the flower is, will actually can develop roots and continue producing a plant that way. So you take off the cut off the top of your pineapple, same thing, stick it in water, and sometimes they'll reroot, sometimes they won't. But if they reroot, then you eventually, when they form some roots, you can stick them in a pot and start growing pineapple. Obviously, you'll need to keep them very warm because it's a tropical fruit, but that can be a lot of fun, especially to do with kids as well. All right, a quick review here before we get into the Q&A. We've talked about seed starting, the basic ingredients. You need a container, soil, seeds, water, and light. We talked about grow light setups, how to deal with common problems like damping off, as well as how to harden off your seedlings so that they have a more well-adapted transition to the outdoor environment when you transplant them in the garden. I mentioned earlier that we have a tool that will help you calculate those planting timelines, and it's called the Gardening Planning Calculator. You may have already used it, and if you have, we'd love to get your feedback. But basically what this does is you take your last average frost date that I mentioned earlier, you plug it into this orange cell here, and all the other dates are calculated for you. It also has handy reference here for the germination timelines and temperatures for each of the major crop types. And then it'll tell you when you need to plant inside and outside. If it doesn't have an inside planting date, that means that you typically direct sow them into the garden. But it'll tell you when you need to start them indoors and outdoors. And it can be really helpful to help you figure out when you need to plant what plants need to be planted when. Also on the right has the harvest timeline. So these are the days to maturity in here, and based on the earliest planting date, it'll give you your earliest harvest date. So if you're really disciplined about planting on time, you should expect a harvest when the date here is indicated. So you can click, there's a link down below the video you can click on to go there, or you can type in seedsgenerations.com/GPC for garden planning calculator to go there, and hopefully that will save you a bunch of time. It literally turns something that can take hours into a few seconds to just plugging in a date, and it gives you all of the dates that you need. On behalf of my family, I'd like to thank you for spending time with me this evening. Apologize for the technical difficulties, but thanks for hanging with us. We not only like to grow vegetables, but we like to save seeds and share them with you. So have you gotten your seeds yet this year? If you have, or even if you have, but especially if you haven't, we invite you to check out our website and see the heirloom seeds that we'd like to share from our family to yours. our kids are involved not only in gardening and harvesting, but in seed saving, processing, packaging, order fulfillment, and it's a true family business. And as my oldest kids get older, I'm starting to involve them in customer service and some of the marketing and doing gardening videos and those kind of things with them. So we'd appreciate if you consider us to help meet your seed needs. Before I go to the Q&A, I want to ask a question of you and see if you can give me some feedback. I want to know, what's your biggest challenge to growing more food? In conversations with gardeners, hundreds of gardeners all around the country, and our customers, I've identified some common reasons for this. Sometimes it's time available. That's probably one of the most common ones, right? Everybody's got limited time. Is it the soil building challenge or fertilizing your crops? If you have poor soil, how do you get more fertile soil to provide better growing conditions? Is it optimizing your space to get the most growth out of what you have? Is it the dreaded weeds competing with your plants? Do you want to do successive plantings so that you always have solid crops available, but you have a challenge getting to it? What's the challenge that you have to growing more food? I'd like to know. So if you can let me know in the chat, I would appreciate it. In my experience, talking with lots of people, there's two primary reasons. The first one is time available, which is kind of be expected just because everybody's busy. But the other one is successive plantings. A lot of people don't do them at all, or some people do them. They may plant a spring garden and then they plant a fall garden, but they don't plant in between. And if you're going to grow the most food out of the space that you have, this is one of the most overlooked methods that will help you grow more food. And I've been thinking about what's ways that I can help people solve these challenges. I can't necessarily give you more time, but there are some things that we can help with. One of the things is like what we're doing with this training, right? I'm trying to share knowledge that I have and experience I have with you to help you be better equipped and to be more efficient with what you're doing. And hopefully that is helpful. And we're going to be trying to produce a lot of gardening videos this year. We'll show you what we're doing and things we've learned, and maybe you can adapt some of those for what you're doing. I think a lot of times it helps to have encouragement from a community. We don't always live in a place where we have gardeners all around us. Our next door neighbors might not be gardeners. We may not even have that many gardening friends. So having encouragement from other people to face that challenge of having to go out and weed the garden, or even better, to actually have somebody help you go out in the garden and do it. But particularly just have the, need some motivation. You have a problem and you're looking for input from other people about how to solve it. Those kind of things I think can be really important to keep at the discipline of gardening and growing more food. I think one of the things is just having help to plant successively, as I mentioned, so you can get more out of your garden. I think it's the most overlooked method to producing more food, is to keep planting throughout the year so that you're always having a harvest. So what I've thought of is maybe we can kind of put a lot of these things together into a membership where we're providing more focused support to our community and our customers. And tentatively, I've decided to name it a Grow More membership, because I want to provide helpful content and training. I mean, we provide a lot of this for free, but I can only do so much kind of answering questions and all that kind of stuff. And I'd like to engage the community of customers that we have in that as well, to provide input and insights into what things that their struggles they've had and how they've overcome them, all those kind of things. I think planning and management tools is part of it. I think if you haven't been really serious about growing and you haven't developed these tools yourself or found them from other people, there's some simple planning tools and management tools, charts and ways of organizing your information and scheduling things so that you can be more efficient with the way that you do things. So this is one of the things that I have some of these I'm continuing to tweak my own tools, and I would like to provide those to people as well. And then one of them, I think, a lot of people, I think one of the reasons why a lot of people only plant a spring garden is because they order all their seeds in the spring, and then they get them and they're like, okay, excitement, I got seeds, I'm going to plant them now. And then that's it. I mean, then it's like, oh, now I got to weed, now I got to water. It's all the challenging stuff. The excitement of the spring seeds arriving in the mail and the planting and stuff has gone away. Well, what if you kept getting shipments of seeds throughout the year, like maybe every few months, so that you have that excitement again and again and again? My thought is that that would probably help people do the successive planting that's going to help them grow more, because they're going to get a new shipment of seeds in the mail that are things that they should be starting at that time of year, and that will help them grow more food through successive planting. So that's one thing that I would like to include in this membership that I'm putting together. And then member discounts is the other one. We do a sales from time to time, but I'd love to have included in this membership a way for our members to always get a discount. So, if you need to order something, you can go right on the website automatically. You're logged in, you get a discount. You can apply in your cart right away. It's there waiting for you, and you don't have to only buy during a sale. So it's always available for you. So let me know what you think about this. This is something that I haven't put everything together for yet, because I wanted to get feedback from our community and see what people are interested in. If this is something that's interesting to you, please let me know. And just let me know in the chat, or if you're watching a recording, reply to an email if that's easier for you, and let us know if this is something that appeals to you, because we really want to help people grow more food. And I think through providing some of these things, we can help people do more with what they have. So one of our goals is to help you get more seed buying value for your money. It's one of the reasons that we run sales. It's also one of the reasons we do this training, because if you're buying a bunch of seeds but a bunch of them are dying, then you're not getting good value for your money, right? So we wanted to help you grow more food. And while Levi here is not going to show up at your door with this little bin of vegetables, you're going to have to grow it, right? Hopefully we can be of assistance in doing that. So until our membership is live, and I'm going to gather feedback from everybody about this, obviously, to figure out how to best create value for you. Until then, I wanted to, as a thank you for coming on this training and spending your time with me, and hopefully taking something away in the training, but I wanted to offer you something more, and that is a discount. Now, we run sales from time to time, but you may not always be ready to order your seeds when we have a sale. So I thought of a way that we can give you a discount that you can use anytime. Okay, so what I did is I created a discount that you can use whenever you're ready to order your seeds, and they're called seed store credits. So you can buy now and shop later and save, and we basically have discounted these for you because you come on this webinar, and for a limited time you can get these at a fairly significant discount depending on how much what size credit you order. So click the link below the video that has, I mentioned, seed store credits, and you can go check that out, and you can buy that credit now and use it whenever you need to, whether that's for buying seeds you need here this spring, or maybe even throughout the rest of the year. Whenever you want to use them, they don't expire. You can use them anytime. So hopefully that's a help to you, and it's a special offer to you as a thank you for coming on this training. All right, it's time for questions. If you haven't already entered your questions, please enter them now. I'm going to dive into all the chats here and see what we have in terms of people that have questions that we can answer. All right, so the first one is from Bethany, and she says, my seeds often don't sprout. When starting seeds indoors, do you have to mind the planting depth as much? Perhaps I'm planting too deep. Do you know how to measure depth? A ruler is difficult with loose soil. Yeah, so I would recommend that you follow the instructions on the seed packets that you get. It'll typically say like a 1/4 inch, um, bigger stuff, which typically you're not going to be planting inside, things like corn or beans. Those often will say cover with a 1/2 inch of soil. But typically for stuff that you're doing inside, it's going to be no more than a 1/4 inch. But often it'll say lightly cover. So what I do now, I realize that you can't quite see them here because they've been watered a bunch. But when you have fresh soil blocks, when I use soil blocks, it actually puts there's a little dimple in the center. So it kind of pre-makes your little hole that you need to have for planting the seed in, right? Well, if you don't have that, if you're planting in the little tray inserts or something where it's just soil, what I do is I take a wooden pencil and I just kind of I don't jab it in. I basically just lightly push it into the middle and kind of whirl it around in a circular motion to kind of create a little crater in the middle. And then put the seeds in that. And then based upon what, if you make it a 1/4 inch deep or so, based on what the instructions say, if it says cover with a 1/4 inch deep, then if you make a 1/4 inch hole and you put the seed at the bottom and you just cover it till it's level and you're good. If it says lightly cover, just use your finger and just kind of brush a little bit of soil on top of it. Typically what that is for, if it says lightly covered, is just so that the seed has some soil around it that has a moisture on it to keep it moist. That's typically the reason why it says lightly cover, so it doesn't dry out. Okay, so with most stuff you're starting inside, you're going to have basically that range. Typically, is going to be lightly cover to about a 1/4 inch depth, and that'll be sufficient. Now, if your seeds don't sprout, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that can go into that. The one common problem is inconsistent watering. If like I mentioned before, if your seeds dry out, then they're gonna die if they dry out enough. The other thing that might be an issue is light. It depends on your lighting situation. Obviously, if you're using a growing light setup like I have here, and you have lights right down near it, there's going to be really intense light. So even if the dirt has some, or the seed has some soil over it, it's going to have enough light to kind of activate the seed, right? If you have indirect light from the sun because it's near a window, but it's kind of like in a not a great spot and it's not getting a lot of light might be a factor playing into it. That would be my recommendation. The top issue is probably inconsistent watering. Aside from non-viable seeds. Now, one issue might be that if you're using old seeds in particular, some seeds will last a long time, some will not last as long. So if you're using one of those and there's a whole list, I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but some seeds only really do well for a year or two in storage. So if you're using one of those seeds, like peppers typically are only good for a couple years. And that's another issue too that I should mention here. If you're talking about, always check what your germination temperature range is. If you're talking about peppers or another heat-loving seedling type, you need to have like 75, even 80 degrees. And a lot of times you don't have that in the ambient temperature in your house. And so for those seeds, temperature is almost always the primary factor. But in many cases, it's a combination of factors. So you just need to look at what's going on with your setup. But consider the viability of your seeds. Maybe do a germination test. If you're having problems with them in the soil, just do put them in a damp paper towel and put them in a plastic bag or something that'll retain the moisture, and put them in the light and see if they germinate or what your germination rate is. If you put 10 of them in there, you'll get, if you get 8 of them to sprout, that's an 80% germination rate. Okay. But make sure you check your germination temperature requirements for your seedlings. And as I mentioned, that's listed in that garden planning calculator that I mentioned earlier. It has both the temperature range for each type of seed as well as how many days to germination. So, some things will germinate in 5 days, some things will take 2 weeks. So, when you're waiting for seeds to come out of the soil, it always seems like it takes longer than it actually does, right? But if it's something like carrots that take 7 to 14 days, it might be that you're just being a little anxious, and they'll come up eventually. But if it's not coming up at all, temperature can be the primary issue for anything that likes really warm germination conditions. Um, Inconsistent watering, if the soil growing medium is drying out, that is probably the issue. And lighting could be another issue as well. The last one I can mention might be the fertility of the soil mix, but typically things will sprout as long as it's got some kind of toxic or something going on in it. So it depends on what your growing mix is, if that's a factor or not. But hopefully I answered that question sufficiently. It really depends. There's a lot of what ifs involved in answering why seeds don't germinate and sprout and grow properly. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, so Tanny says, I tried those pods and they all sprouted then died. I'm assuming you're talking about the peat pellets that are like a puck, and they sprouted and died, which that can be an issue, primarily because, and you might have the same issue with, well, the problem with these puck things that expand into these little pellets or little pods or whatever, is that it's basically just peat moss. So there's really not a whole lot of nutrients in that growing medium. One reason I don't use them, amongst others, is that you really want to have some minerals and organic matter in the soil, which is why that soil starting mix recipe I gave you was primarily compost, secondarily peat moss, and then a couple other things. The soil block mix that I make actually has some minerals put into it as well. It has some phosphate, some lime, and some other stuff to provide some of the basic minerals that the seedlings need. So my guess is that the lack of nutrients in that growing medium with those pods was the reason that happened. She also says, I also tried that greenhouse cover with the pellet, but still they all died before the leaves really developed. Again, I think that's probably a nutrient issue. And since I'm looking at it right here, I'll mention this as well. She says, I'm living in a frost-free zone, Long Beach, California. I've got cousins in Long Beach. It creates timing issues due to unknown temperature shifts. Well, growing up in Southern California, though we were inland near the mountains, I understand what you're saying about it's difficult because you're not used to having frost and that kind of thing. This is kind of one of these things that I hate to say it, but everybody experiences it. The only difference with you is that you're not typically expecting cold temperatures or a frost. So maybe the problem is that because they're so infrequent, that when they come, then they surprise you. Well, you kind of have to do what everybody else does in other parts of the country that have a lot more temperature fluctuations, is you just got to keep an eye on the weather and constantly looking at what the temperature is going to be. And this is primarily an issue for when you're getting ready to transplant into the garden, right? Using your last frost date and the number of weeks from the last frost date recommended on the seed packet for transplanting into the garden, that's a rule of thumb, but you always have to look specifically at the weather conditions that you're dealing with at the time that you're considering doing this, right? Like I recommended before, don't plant them earlier than the 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after last frost date, if that's what it says on the seed packet. But it doesn't mean that right at 14 days, you're going to plop that baby on the ground, regardless of what the temperature is outside, right? No, don't do that. If you're having really cool conditions, or maybe you're having really hot conditions, you may want to wait before you transplant them. And this webinar is not really going into like planting in the garden, that kind of detail, but a quick tip on transplanting. Typically, it's going to be best if you transplant on a cloudy day, so you have indirect sunlight instead of direct sunlight. And also, I found that it typically works better if you do it in the late afternoon, so that if you do it in the morning and then you have a warm day, now it's going right into even if it's in direct sun, it's like outside during the hottest part of the day. As long as your nighttime temperature is not too low, I found that often it's a more gradual transition for the first day in the ground to actually go in the afternoon, let it go overnight, get a thorough watering, and then it has the full cycle the next day, rather than putting them in the ground in the morning, especially if it's like going to be a clear day with direct sun and pretty warm. That's not a good day to transplant, especially in the morning. I would wait till the afternoon or the evening and do it then. But if you're going to be having a big span of like hot, clear, sunny weather, I'd recommend trying to wait to do it till after that hot weather streak is there. Just like I would recommend waiting until after a cold streak that's coming is over, because you're just kind of rolling the dice if you're doing that. Now, if they're in the ground and cold weather comes, you're going to want to cover them with a row cover or something to help give them some additional temperature protection. Wrap them in a blanket, basically. If it's, maybe they've only been in the ground for a few days and suddenly you have a heat wave, you can actually use shade cloth and cover them with the shade cloth to help reduce the amount of direct sunlight that is going on them. And that's a way that you can help reduce some of the transplant shock. Okay. Let's see what's next. Martha, thanks for your feedback. That fertilizing and weed competition are your biggest challenges. That's helpful. She also asked, can you use the planting calculator for successive planting? It is not currently set up to do that. However, I am working on a successive planting calculator, but I am not sure how I'm going to release that. It might be one of the tools that I include in our membership program. So there's you can get successive planting calculators elsewhere. I mean, really, it's just a matter of planting on a predetermined interval, and you can do some reading on how to do that and such. I like it. The most common one is successive plantings with salad crops like lettuce. And typically you're going to plant every like 2 or 3 weeks, a small number, so that you keep having lettuce coming into maturity on a regular basis. So you always have fresh lettuce, right? Now, which is a good thing to do, especially in the hotter part. When it's coming to maturity in the hotter part of the year, lettuce tends to bolt. So typically it's better to cut. I don't recommend pulling the plant out. If you cut the head of lettuce off completely when it's hot, that's going to be better, because then if you just pick off the outer leaves, then the rest of it might bolt. If it's a cooler time of the year and it's not prone to bolting, then if you don't mind taking the time to do it, what we often do is just pick off the outer leaves, the more mature leaves off the plant, and leave the rest of it there to continue growing. And then that way you can kind of do a continual harvest from your lettuce over time. So it really depends upon your situation as to what works best there. But the biggest thing is that for successive planting, it's just this is where I think like a successive planting calculator can be helpful, because they can kind of give you some guidelines to think about what you may want to plant, and then intervals that you want to plant them on. And then you can, particularly if it's a calculator, if you plug in a date, it can give you the other dates of when you're going to plant those things. So those are some of the tools I'm kind of talking about, possibly developing further for our members to really help give them more tools in their tool bag, so to speak, to grow more food more consistently. All right, so hopefully that answered your question and was helpful, Martha. Thanks for asking. Camille, if you're still with us. Let's see here. Camille said, I've had problems with clean soil for 2 years. I've tried reusing peat moss, vermiculite, etc. from past years. I've also sterilized it in the oven, but it still had fungus or other issues. Any suggestions? I've also washed my seedling trays with soap and water. Where's the problem? It makes me want to just buy all new again, but I don't want to waste. How to tell if the soil is sterilized? Okay. So this is a good question. It's actually a hard one to answer because there's so many kind of variables that go into this. Unlike most gardeners, if you're actually sterilizing the growing medium or your soil in the oven, that's more than most do. I actually don't typically do that either. Now, it depends on what kind of fungus you're talking about. If you're talking about like, you have some algae or whatever growing on your growing medium with your seedlings, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if it's not harming the plants, then it isn't necessarily a negative thing, even if it kind of doesn't look great. Because I've had that on a regular basis, especially stuff where if I'm growing the seedlings, I actually often have this with peppers because peppers grow kind of slow. And to reduce moisture loss, I'll put that little clear cover over the seedling trays. Because the environment's very moist, those ones are the ones that typically, for me, have the most fungus issues. Like typically, they're going to be like algae growth or something on the surface of the soil. But I don't typically have problems with damping off. So if damping off is the problem you have, and if you're still on, let me know if that is the problem you're having. I'd recommend trying what I mentioned in the presentation about using a antifungal treatment of some sort, like a diluted hydrogen peroxide or maybe a chamomile tea to fight the fungal infection. Um, Ultimately, if it's not having a significant negative impact on the plants, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If it is having a negative impact on the plant, then you probably want to look at further soil sterilization measures. But particularly, it doesn't sound like you've added antifungal treatment measures, and that might be the thing that you need to do to reduce problems like damping off from killing your plants. Um, the last part of your question there, you said how to tell if the soil is sterilized. I mean, you can't really. I mean, really, you're heating it at a certain temperature, and if the bacteria that are in the soil die at that temperature, then they're gone. But there's actually an argument made about not sterilizing soil, in part because the bacteria and stuff in the soil is part of the life of the soil. So sterilizing it does have some negative impact in terms of microbiological activity in the soil. So if I were you, what I would do is I would actually look at what your options are for antifungal treatments. If you're having problems with fungus killing your plants, like damping off, then I would avoid overwatering for one, and two, I would look at maybe a hydrogen peroxide spray or something like that that helps to fight the fungal growth directly in that environment, and hopefully that will give you some success. So let me know if you have any further questions along those lines. Tanny says, thank you. I appreciate your question, Tanny. Thanks for coming and joining us for the training. Let's see here. If you have any other questions, folks, please let me know, and I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we're going to look at wrapping up here. So if you don't have any other questions, I will say on behalf of my wife Shannon and our 7 kids, thanks so much for coming and attending this training. Hopefully it was helpful to you. If you have any other questions, feel free to chat us on the page or just send us an email. Let us know if there's anything we do to help you. Particularly looking for your feedback and input on this idea of having a membership program where we can provide you additional support, provide you with seed shipments throughout the year to help you keep growing and grow more food with what you have available to you. And last thing, if you're not ready to buy your seeds yet, but you still want a discount, you can get discounted seed store credits, which is available on the sale page for the Plan Your Garden sale. So go there and check it out. Let us know if you have any questions. And we appreciate your time and attention. Thanks so much for coming. And I hope you have a great gardening season. We'll be in touch.